When it comes to talking about Zach LaVine of the Chicago Bulls, there are some things we just can't deny. He's only 27 years of age, and he's already a two-time NBA All-Star. So, multiple-time All-Star, only 27 years of age. In theory, you're looking at him getting ready to enter what should be the peak years of his career. And you look at the last contract that he ultimately got from the Chicago Bulls, the 4 years or whatever it was, 80 million, excuse me. I mean, at the time, I questioned the deal just because of my beliefs about what Zach LaVine would be as a player or not. But the contract honestly kind of worked out well for the team. I mean, the ability to only pay an all-star level player like LaVine $20 million the past couple of years allowed them the flexibility to go bring in a guy like a DeRozan, trade for a Vucevic in his contract, bring in the Alex Carusos and the Lonzo Balls of the world. So having that contract and having LaVine locked up into that contract, honestly, worked out well for the team. He was 12th in the league in points per game last season as the number 2 option behind DeMar DeRozan. And you come into this offseason now, and with all the talk about Zach LaVine being an unrestricted free agent, the Bulls are in a bit of a bind. Because there's no question, it is hard to replace his production. However, we must also be honest about it and say that he is not a true alpha dog, true number 1 option. He is not. And if we're still debating that, then we've lost the plot here. And heading into this offseason, you think about what's going to happen with Zach LaVine. A lot of talk about this, especially amongst Bulls fans and Bulls media. Perhaps, depending on your perspective, the positive here for the Bulls is that they hold a lot of the leverage. They can offer more money over more years going through them than any other team could on the open market. So that is a big piece of leverage, not to mention the fact that LaVine's been there the past 4 or 5 years. So playing in a big market's created opportunities for him. The team's enjoyed at least a certain level of success this past season. They have some of the cards here, which brings the whole conversation around Zach LaVine and giving him the max contract. And I look at it like this. While I understand that Bulls fans probably have some emotional attachments to LaVine based off of the past several seasons that he's played for them, the reality is the Bulls would be crazy to give him a max contract because of what they would have to commit to Zach LaVine, the downturn in performance we saw out of LaVine this past season and what that kind of represents, and the overall roster construction where you're tying so much into LaVine and as a byproduct DeRozan as well, it creates some major challenges. Let's talk first about what the Bulls would have to commit to Zach LaVine. He's not going to take less than the max, and frankly, nor should he. And you look at what the max would represent for LaVine and represent for the Bulls. It's going to be about 30-ish% of the salary cap or so. So you're talking about next year, it'd be $36.6 million. The year after, $39.5. And then it keeps going up until year 4, you get to $45.3 million. And then that 5th year, which certainly would be a player option, you would assume, LaVine would be on the hook for $48.3 million at age 32. Which in and of itself should be incredibly concerning because that is a lot of money to tie into one player, especially when that one player is not a true alpha. Committing 30% or so of your salary cap space to a number 2 option is incredibly risky, especially when you're not a contending team as currently constructed. And let's be absolutely clear. As much as Bulls fans want to look at last season, and even as much as I wanted to buy in at one point in time and say that this team could contend if they made 1 or 2 big moves, that was always a caveat for me. The reality is, as currently constructed, they are absolutely not a contender. Injuries my ass. In fact, that's a part of it. Have a bunch of guys that have injury problems and injury history. And what should be really concerning for Bulls fans is, if you want to win a championship at the end of the day, is Zach LaVine the type of guy that in 4 years you want to be tying $45+ million to? And these types of contracts a lot of time can be incredibly hazardous down the road. See James Harden, see Russell Westbrook, see John Wall. Now some might point to somebody like a Chris Middleton getting max money at the time from Milwaukee. Valid point until you really think about it and you say, what's the key distinction, the key difference? Milwaukee had the Greek freak. Milwaukee has Giannis. Milwaukee knew that they had an alpha dog MVP level type of player. They had a true legit number one. Even a few years ago, you could see that he was going to be there. He was there and going to be there going forward. The Bulls do not have that. So circumstances and situation, it's much different. And even when you're comparing Middleton's game to Zach LaVine's game, they're different players. And Middleton, frankly, let's be clear, is a better all-around player than LaVine. But it's not just about the money you would have to commit to LaVine. You have to look at the downturn in performance as DeRozan's right-hand man this past season. And I'm not just talking in terms of points per game. The overall shooting percentages were down from the previous year. And some of you are going to say, well, that's because he was playing through the knee injuries and this and that. Well, if anything, wouldn't that be even more of an alarming concern here? Is the fact that there always seems to be some type of knee issue with Zach LaVine. And we saw it in this 2021-22 season when he became more of a below-the-rim player. He was far less effective than he was the year before. And even when you want to compare it to the previous year or previous years, if anything, you would say what he did in 2021-2022 season is much more in line with his historical trends, and the season before, 2020-2021, was more of an outlier. You could absolutely say that, and the numbers kind of back that up. And then when you talk about paying this type of money to a guy to play, on average, just over 60 games a year, yeah, it's great that he's entering perhaps the peak of his career, but the number of injury problems he's seeming to have, especially involving his knees, doesn't that raise a little bit of a red flag here? Isn't that a bit of a concern? Because you saw just how different he was at times last year with the knee injuries bothering him. He was a much different player. Much different. Not nearly as effective or efficient as consistent. He wasn't. And that's the guy that we now want to tie up $36.6 million, $39.5 million, $42.4 million, $45.3 million. Yeah, it's not our money. I grant you that, but fuck. You sign a guy for that, it significantly hamstrings and limits what you could do in terms of your roster construction. And let's talk about that for a moment. Because basically by committing max money to Zach LaVine, you're tying up close to 60% of your cap space into two wing defenders. And when you think about wanting to be a contender, you have to look at some of the teams in the Eastern Conference and you say, how do the Bulls stack up? And the reality is they don't stack up with Milwaukee. They do not stack up with Miami. They do not stack up very well with Boston, especially in a 7-game playoff series. If you want to win a championship out of the East, you're going to have to go through some configuration or combination of those teams. And even retaining LaVine doesn't really put you any closer to that. You also have to think bigger picture here, in my opinion. Not only does bringing in LaVine challenge you in terms of how you match up with some of these other teams in the East, it basically means that you're throwing Patrick Williams' development under the bus entirely. And at that point in time, you might as well freaking trade him. It would be impossible for Patrick Williams to develop into the type of Luol Deng type of Kawhi Leonard type, oh my God, that some of you think he can, having to play third or even fourth fiddle right now offensively behind a DeRozan, a LaVine, and a Vucevic. It's just not going to freaking happen. Now, I'm not for sitting here and saying you got to sit there and wait for Patrick Williams to develop. Why the hell would you? But for those of you that want to see that happen and believe that can happen, it cannot happen with Zach LaVine jacking up 18 to 19 shots a damn game. And how is this team going to be able to address their problems in the front court? Now, maybe there's a whole separate deal here of trading away Vucevic and having to retool the makeup of this roster. How are you going to get real wing defenders? Like, even fundamentally, it is one thing if you carry a DeRozan. It is another thing, though, when you carry a LaVine and both of these guys have to be on the floor at the same time in big money situations. We've seen at times over the past few years just how bad LaVine can be in the clutch. The number of brain farts and horrendous shots he throws up. Sure, for every one clutch shot he hits, there's 4 or 5 other stupid decisions you say, what the hell were you thinking about? Think about the roster construction. You basically got two guys that are both meh defenders, that are your top two options, that you're sitting there and having to play in the lineup at the same time. Like, the whole dynamics of this roster doesn't work. It just doesn't. And for those of you who are going to say, well, what would you do? Well, even if you're going to sit there and try and argue, well, what other better options are there? What other things can you really do? Are you going to try and trade for a Donovan Mitchell, do a sign and trade with Zach LaVine? You've got to do something. Because giving LaVine the max contract feels like a recipe for absolute freaking disaster. And I'm sorry, but if you're a Bulls fan and you actually care about the right thing, which is winning an NBA championship, LaVine as your number two option ain't that dude that's going to make it happen. He's just not. You've seen enough of him to understand what he is and, more importantly, what he isn't when it really matters, when the chips are on the line. I'm just not paying a max money deal to a guy like him. I'm just not. And if the Bulls do that, I promise you, they will. They will. Especially if they give LaVine this max contract and they intend to keep him, they will live to regret it.